Happy holidays! Time to feel sad! From 2005 to 2008, Moral Orel aired on Adult Swim, a programming block with a particularly hit-or-miss track record. Oh, look at that. He's a cop, but he's also like a talking butt with legs. And for the better part of a decade, the show appeared to be like any other Bush-era, edgy, adult animated comedy whose humor was predicated on the novelty of cussing cartoon characters, but this time with a religious satire bend. In reality, however, across its 3 seasons, Moral Orel developed into one of the most intelligent, subversive, and human shows Adult Swim has ever been home to, albeit not without a few stumbling blocks along the way. Its early seasons see Orel Puppington, a young, well-meaning boy living in the fictional town of Moralton, State of Soda, having mostly episodic misadventures as he continually misinterprets his church's weekly sermons to catastrophic ends. The episode premises get very outlandish very fast, from Orel accidentally developing an addiction to crack cocaine to lobbying to get eggs banned from his town upon believing them to be obscene. Like I said, Bush-era comedy was a whole thing. The humor is snappy, taking the Mel Brooks approach of having plenty of smaller, understated gags between larger, more memorable punchlines. This detail-oriented approach to writing is also present in the audiovisual department. The town of Moralton is depicted lavishly, with bespoke props that are their own additional jokes or pieces of foreshadowing. In the 3rd episode, we see a poster on Orel's bedroom wall for a band called Crucifolks. Then, 23 episodes later, we're introduced to the band in an episode that centers on one of their ex-members. Sets have their own distinguishable color palettes, at times drenched in diegetic light or shot from expressive camera angles. Staging is always clear and shots are purposefully composed, never overusing the static 3/4 view like its contemporaries. The final season pushes the camera work to a bewildering degree, incorporating a handful of intricate dynamic shots that, given the medium, seem like they should be impossible. The animation is lively and expressive. It rarely holds on a frame for longer than feels natural without good reason, instead letting characters bounce between poses as they speak, and letting the characters gently shuffle idly in quiet moments. It's in these quiet moments that the sound design also shines. There's a nearly uncanny accuracy to the on-screen movements and the Foley that accompany them, the clearest example being the sound of ice rattling in Clay's drink when he speaks to Orel in his study, a staple of the series.
Parents sometimes have to mix things up a little bit. That means swinging.
Swinging?
Yes!
Meanwhile, in the memorable episode Nature, the skin-crawlingly close-mic'd sound of flies helps to elevate an already unbearably tense episode to new levels of discomfort. Most folks don't really notice sound design. You're kinda not supposed to, but as a sound designer myself, I'd be remiss not to give the spotlight to the sound team and the folks at Margarita Mix for crafting some of the best Foley I've seen in animation. The original score is playful and childlike, with a handful of variations on motifs that meaningfully contribute to the series' conceit, but the selections from then contemporary indie acts are really where it's at. In fact, if there's one thing the show is famous for, it's probably introducing a generation of unsuspecting teens to the Mountain Goats, whose music was used in 3 different uniquely crushing episodes to wonderful effect. Every aspect of Moral Orel is, in some way, in service to the mood it's trying to evoke in a given moment, often in ways that don't directly interact, but that sit together in the final product to paint a full emotional picture. There's a real sense of unifying vision on display despite being a show that bounces between tone as much as it does, though that aforementioned late-aughts aimless edginess rears its ugly head every now and again. On the whole, the show uses its transgressive humor and subject matter as weapons aimed at the injustices and hypocrisies of organized religion and American conservatism, punching up rather than down. Hell, it's technically the second American animated series to feature a recurring lesbian, and she's one of the best and most beloved characters, simultaneously giving multifaceted gay representation and a constructive form of retaliation against the status quo. Moral Orel would have been airing around the time atheist debate club types were flooding internet forums with cyclical argumentative rhetoric, so again, it's easy to make the assumption that the show aligns itself with the like, intentionally or otherwise, but it has a far from one-dimensional or pessimistic view of faith. We see that Orel's belief in God isn't the source of his problems or mistakes, but instead, that the ways in which the Bible's teachings are perverted by the residents of Moralton's own agendas and sold to Orel wholesale are. In the episode Praying, Orel gets closer to God by incorporating elements of different faiths into his own, something seen as unchristian by his parents and peers, and as a result becomes one step closer to learning the invaluable lesson that he can't always take the word of adults in his life at face value. While the early episodes shine in their own right, in the full scope of the series, they're a springboard for the latter half of Season 2 and especially into Season 3, where the cast and setting are established enough to be played with to their full extent. In those later episodes, it becomes clear that almost nothing in the show up to that point was left truly inconsequential, meaning yes, eggs being banned from Moralton has sweeping implications about certain characters and events. As I've hinted at, the final season is also where the emotional core of the series is pushed to the forefront. The show sheds its satirical dark comedy skin to become a fully fledged drama, breaking down all of the baggage, anxieties, and traumas of its cast in raw, uncompromising detail, contextualizing all of their idiosyncrasies and actions. Wait, wrong clip, my bad. Now, to get fully into why the show is as well regarded as it is, and why I'm talking about it in the first place, I have to spoil large swaths of the show. I'm talking treating scripts for cancelled episodes found on the creator's MySpace's canon levels. I know spoilers can't ruin a good story, but I feel that this is a show worth watching as fresh as possible. In my eyes, the twists and turns found within its elaborately woven, non-linear final season are best experienced as the creators intend. Though, as an aside, it comes with just about 100 content warnings. There are a few things the show doesn't try to tackle, however I feel it does those subjects justice in almost every instance. Season 3 is indisputably confrontational. It feels like a culmination of a writer's room filled to the brim with anger for not only the Bush administration, but the culture that led to its existence in perpetuity. Chiefly among the pillars of Midwestern conservatism Moral Orel's final season levels its frustrations at is the very institution of the nuclear family. The show all but outright deems it a scourge, drowning working class America in a deluge of societal pressure, false promises, and emotional repression. This may seem like an extreme stance to some. There's nothing inherently wrong with a family unit made up of two parents and their kids after all, but to understand why the series has such disdain for the concept, I'll run through history's greatest hits of what makes the nuclear family what it is, so we're all on the same page. Amongst the Puritans of 16th century colonialist America, there was the belief that, as God's seed passed down to Abraham, it was therefore a parent's duty to pass the Holy Spirit on by having children. Also by having slaves. Solitary lifestyles were shunned and considered bad for the moral sanctity of their communities, with those choosing not to marry being grouped together arbitrarily as not to be alone. This was a culture so entwined with theocracy and monetary hierarchy that an adult with their own spouse, children, and home could be punished by the government for disobeying the parents they didn't even still share a roof with. This is what I mean when I describe the nuclear family as an institution, having been built upon a 500-plus-year-old precedent in Western culture for one's blood relations to define their social structure and status. An institution that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels posited in the Communist Manifesto, yes, we're going there already, is both a product and a tool of capital, and, extrapolating a bit, that a rigid adherence to the family structure was motivated by personal gain. That sincere altruism could only present itself on a communal, humanitarian basis, not a familial one. On the complete opposite side of the spectrum lies familism, an ideology that claims family values are of utmost importance and that families should provide for itself by itself with no outside help. This grew to popularity, if not by name, by dogma, amongst the conservative working class of 1950s America. Following the Second World War, also known as World War II, a generation of adults hopped up on jingoism, relief at not being the ones that died in the war, unwavering reverence for their elders, and government programs to support those returning from the army made their primary goals marrying young, having 2.5 kids, and becoming homeowners. In following the trajectory expected of them, their personal agency was completely diminished in exchange for financial agency, and in this laid a pathway to many of the same mistakes their parents made. I think it's fairly well known at this point, but that lasting image of the 50s, of a time of economic flourish, of the perfect American family, white picket fences, and well-kept lawns, it was all a sham. Loveless marriages held together only by the lofty stigma divorce held, cold and unsympathetic parenting, racism, sexism, xenophobia, and more was what really lay just beneath that surface. In doing research, I was surprised to find the term nuclear family actually refers to nuclear fission, as in being a part of the same core. All my life, I thought it was derived from the renewed importance put on traditional family structures in post-nuclear warfare America. This misconception of the American family is so ingrained in the cultural narrative of that period, but how did this happen? Historian Stephanie Kuntz has used the lens of nostalgia to describe the picturesque version of the 1950s that doesn't in any way match up with the reality of the era, one rife with opiate addiction, abuse, economic imbalance, and domestic violence. Pushing that notion further, I'd argue that the lasting impression shared even by those who grew up or made their families during that time is heavily informed by the advertising, iconography, and media of the time, all of which perpetuate this long-lasting sleek utilitarian perfection, and of families that instinctually and unflinchingly cared for one another in a way no real family could possibly live up to. It's this assumption of the intrinsic sanctity and efficacy of the nuclear family, growing and adapting to era after era, that leads to a deep-seated belief that there is, in turn, something lacking in any form of deviation from this predefined structure. Familism and its adjacent paradigms are practically hardwired to reject or belittle non-traditional family structures, notably single or same-sex parents. Even beyond outright objection, there's a kind of expected trauma in not experiencing a traditional biological mother-father upbringing that pervades Western culture. There's almost something to this idea, rather that the real cause of this potential perceived trauma isn't the lack of a rigid mother-father structure, but of the increased likelihood of poverty that comes from being marginalized and lacking proper extended support networks. There's also evidence within child psychology to suggest that what's more important to a child as they grow and establish their worldview is a consistency in their set of guardians, rather than who or how many make up that set. Despite the evidence against it, the importance put upon having both a present biological father figure and a present biological mother figure remains a pillar of media that deals with growing up in abusive or otherwise dysfunctional households, one I worried Moral Orel would play into. Thankfully, this isn't the case at all. As the series draws to a close, the ubiquity, superiority, and piety of the nuclear family is challenged when the veneers its citizens wear crack, putting on display the true nature of their lives. We see marriages fall apart, infidelity left and right, social transgressions, leaving the children of Moralton to gradually be exposed to the failings of their parents. But in this, there is hope. After a sea of hardships, many of the citizens find their truest happiness through means that eschew traditional family structures entirely. Nurse Bendy, who suffered a childhood rife with abuse and neglect, appears detached and cold in her day-to-day life, but behind closed doors she regresses and fantasizes about her idyllic life, one in which she's the housewife of a perfect nuclear family. We see her fantasy shatter around her in the episode Alone, in which she's confronted head-on with the toxicity of her role within her imaginary family in a scene that I don't think I should show. It's dark. In a later episode, she reunites with town delinquent Joe, who is revealed to be her son, and the two begin living together in Bendy's apartment. Joe, who acted out constantly in his home life up until that point, finally shows a good-natured side and takes positively to his new life. Both characters learn to shed the ironic detachment they wore as self-preservation measures, and are fulfilled by their newfound mutual roles as mother and son. Similar to Joe and Nurse Bendy, Reverend Putty and Stephanie both unite for the first time as father and daughter, though in Stephanie's adulthood. We see the two spend much of their time together, making up for the time lost to never having had the chance to know one another. Their case is interesting in that Putty is the sole minister of Moralton, who learns at age 60 that he has a daughter who is both an atheist and a lesbian, things he's accepting of. His age has wizened and softened him, allowing him to understand the value of alternative lifestyles. It's important to note that he has no obligation to be part of Stephanie's life given the circumstances. She's nearly 30, but he's invested in their relationship. Putty is stuck getting Flanderized a lot of the time, as he's a vehicle for many of the show's more outwardly satirical jabs at organized religion, but there's a fairly clear distinction between which of his roles should be taken seriously and put towards his characterization. Stephanie, on the other hand, is a much more even character. She's one of the first people in Moralton that Orel makes a meaningful, empathetic connection to, as she's one of the only residents willing to be vulnerable with him, arguably because of the ways in which she differs from the rest of the town. Censordoll is an interesting case where, despite being a sinister figure within the series, she has an arc centered around her own empowerment. Having had her reproductive organs removed shortly after her birth was something that troubled Censordoll and colored her outlook on life. However, at the end of the series, she finds an opportunity to leverage her long-fixated infertility to become the current mayor's mistress, becoming a sort of Lady Macbeth figure. In this, her inability to bear children, to take part in the construct of the nuclear family, becomes her greatest strength. Miss Sculptham is... So there's this, honestly, thankfully scrapped episode with a script floating around online where Miss Sculptham learns she's pregnant with her rapist's child and seeks out a similar father figure for the child in another incarcerated rapist who she marries in the same day that she meets him. Sculptham winds up divorcing him a day later and falls in love with a female police officer who she also attempts to marry in like a day, only to be refused as gay marriage was illegal in the States in 2008. Look, it's not a very good script. It comes off more more awkward than anything and probably didn't really receive any punching up or rewrites, but it's getting at something that was, at the time, very real. In late aughts America, a woman could marry a man with a life sentence in prison for rape and murder, but not another woman.